All right, thank you everyone for joining us today for a special Frank Marlowe Memorial Lecture to be given by Richard Wrangham. These lectures are given in the honor of Frank Marlowe, who earned his PhD in anthropology at UCLA in 1997, advised by Nick Burton-Jones. Today, we're going to talk a bit about Frank's early time just after he graduated from UCLA, because shortly after receiving his PhD, he was hired by the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University. And during his years at Harvard, Frank published a slew of really important papers. So his research was of a very broad scale in terms of the types of data he used, the subjects he addressed. He did cross-cultural analyses, studies like that shown on the bottom right here, analyzing the relationship between men's contribution to diet and female reproductive success. He also did remote sensing base analyses of the productivity of forager habitats compared to other landscapes. And of course, a great deal of his work was deeply empirical, grounded in his long-term field research with the Hadza community, including, of course, his monograph that was published by UC Press in 2010 on the Hadza people. And during this time at Harvard, Frank also published one of his most impactful review articles that a number of speakers have already referenced this year, Hunter-Gatherers and Human Evolution. And this is a nice paper that lays out both the value of studying living people for making inferences into the past and the kind of biases that we do well to be mindful of when we make such inferences. So it's a fantastic paper. It serves to articulate a lot of the challenges of doing this kind of work. And at Harvard, Frank developed and taught a whole variety of different courses, including one particular graduate seminar that I want to talk about that was called Apes and Human Foragers. He taught this today, co-taught with our speaker today, Richard Wrangham. And that was an incredible course. His curiosity, Frank's curiosity, and his depth of knowledge of forager societies really shone in that class, and was of course multiplied by Richard's presence and his perspective grounded in years of studies of wild chimpanzees, both in Gombe National Park and in Kambale in Western Uganda. So it was a great pleasure to be a part of that seminar, and also to facilitate today's Frank Marlowe lecture by Richard. So Richard is a research professor of biological anthropology at Harvard University. Many of you know, of course, he's written extensively on the evolution of primate societies. He founded the Kambale Chimpanzee Project in 1987. He's written extensively about the behavioral ecology of primates, evolution of violence and warfare, the importance of cooking in human evolution. And his most recent book is titled The Goodness Paradox: The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Richard and say thank you so much for joining us here for this Frank Marlowe Memorial Lecture.
Thank you, Brian, for that great introduction. And so I gave a title of Hunter-Gatherers, Homo duplex, and the Evolution of Human Groupishness. I'm going to have to explain that title in a minute. Let me first of all just pick up on Frank. More than 100 papers, 64 of them on Hadza, I count, and quite a few of them on cooperation, with a number of topics that you see listed there, including one where the title was Hadza Cooperation. And so it seems fair enough to go for an aspect of cooperation myself. I'll explain what groupishness is in a minute, and here's how I'm going to divide the time. An evolutionary puzzle, first of all, then the hypothesis for explaining it, and the test with data on self-domestication, and then a summary with a very brief reference in the parentheses here to Homo duplex. There's not going to be much time. Okay, groupishness. So I want to define this as a tendency to commit costly pro-social acts for which the pathway to compensatory fitness benefits is unpredictable. Third-party punishment is a classic example here. So B and C have an interaction, and then A punishes B for being mean to C, and A does not know how or if he will get a return benefit. So this is quite similar to one or two other sort of concepts that people have used. I prefer it, but it is similar to strong reciprocity, which has been defined as a predisposition to cooperate with others, yes, and to punish those who violate the norms of cooperation, yes, personal cost, yes, even when it's implausible to expect that these costs will be repaid. And I think that's just putting it slightly wrong. I think you should just say that we don't know how they will be repaid, but it is plausible to think that they will be somehow. Okay, so with this definition of groupishness, I want to make 3 points about it. First of all, it is a human universal. The ultimatum game showed that very nicely. It certainly shows that also there are variations in the degree of groupishness, but one of the key messages of this study, which of course included Frank's contribution with the Hadza, is that the canonical model based on self-interest fails in all of the societies. Offers are made that are higher than expected, and recipients refuse offers at a higher level than expected. Secondly, groupishness is not known in non-human primates. And I think that fruit collection is a kind of nice example here, because you've got lots of descriptions of people collecting fruit among hunters and gatherers, and they certainly can be on their own and just collecting fruits on their own. But when they're in groups doing it, then there is a division of labor and people automatically help each other, and you don't get a strict division of the spoils in relationship to the effort put in. So some individuals are paying costs to help others, whereas non-human primates, of course, they are all just totally individually competitive. And then thirdly, although doubtless lots of groupishness is influenced by culture, it certainly does seem to include some evolved traits. And I really like the concept that Chudek and Henrik sort of pulled together as a norm psychology, a set of adaptations for inferring, remembering, enforcing, and conforming to moral norms, such as these things having a conscience and feeling shame and so on. These are significant because they appear to be cross-culturally universal. They're evidenced very young in life, at least the interest in classifying behavior by bad and good and responding to it appropriately. And shame and other emotions are associated with involuntary emotions. So that sure seems like a signal of an evolved characteristic. I certainly acknowledge that we're not talking about every aspect of cooperation among non-kin here. Groupishness is an important one, I think, but then the other two big ones in my mind are exceptional cognitive skills that have been argued by a number of people to be important in allowing really complex forms of organization involving mostly direct reciprocity. And then there's also cultural selection, which produces all sorts of systems that favor cooperation, even independent of groupishness. So we're talking about one component contributing to ultra cooperation in humans. And thinking about this definition, I just want to compare it with what I'm calling here non-groupishness. And I wish there was a better word. Maybe someone here can think of one, which is everything other than groupishness. And it's what animals do. So I'm calling it here a tendency to commit any kind of act, selfish or prosocial and so on, for which the pathway to compensatory fitness benefits is predicted. So this is what we ordinarily expect of individual animals, that they assess the possibility of getting some fitness benefit, either through kin selection, sexual selection, direct reciprocity, and so on, and they commit. And what they don't do is what I've been defining as groupish in humans. So if we're going to understand groupishness as an adaptive trait, then it's going to depend on indirect reciprocity. And Dick Alexander was the first person who really expounded on this. He said the return is expected from someone other than the recipient of the beneficence, that is, from essentially any individual or collection of individuals in the group. So we see here on the left from Noack and Sigmund's paper on cooperation, the simple scheme of one version of indirect reciprocity, and you focus on A, and A helps B, and then the expectation is that someone, who we're going to call C here, subsequently helps A, and A gets a benefit. So the question is, well, why does C expected to help A? And by the way, why does A help B in the first place? So these are the problems that people try and grapple with. I just want to think about the major approaches that people have taken here to the question: how did natural selection favor pro-sociality in which the individual cannot assess that any other particular individual is going to give them a return benefit? It's an unpredictable payoff. It may happen or it may not happen, but on average, of course, it has to happen. Well, I think of three main hypotheses. One is some version of group selection, where the fact that groupishness is leading to individuals in the group benefiting on average is in favor of the idea that this could work a group selection argument. But you've got a free rider problem that I don't believe anyone has really satisfactorily solved. That is to say, individuals should take advantage of the cooperative efforts of others and not pay them back. Secondly, there's the idea that really fine cognitive skills in humans is able to build on direct reciprocity or through other mechanisms to produce systems of indirect reciprocity that benefit individuals. And again, you've got the free rider problem, and particularly the free rider problem in both cases, actually, when you have significant power asymmetries. I'll come back to that in a minute. And the third one is the one I'm going to talk about, enforced cooperation, where the benefit of this argument, it seems to me that it solves the pre-rider problem. The difficulties about it are that it's a bit startling because it involves a lot of killing in the human past, and it's not that easy to test directly, as we'll see. So here's a quote from Phillips, a review in 2018, drawing attention to the problem of asymmetric power for indirect reciprocity. Asymmetric power presents serious problems for reciprocity theory in that a dominant individual faces a temptation to cheat in interactions with subordinates that's likely to far outweigh any individual selective benefits gained through reciprocal mechanisms. So, two people help each other and they are able to be more successful in the hunt, maybe, and get some meat. And the alpha individual comes along and says, hey, great, I'll take that, thank you very much. And generally, the alpha individual can do that because the alpha individual is defined by their ability to dominate everybody else. And that's the fundamental problem. And the alpha individual clearly does do well. I just want to draw attention to that with this graph, which is looking at paternity from measured cases of primates. And in the purple dashed line, I crudely just tried to put in an indication of the way the curve is going. And in the blue dotted line, the blue line with dots, you see what the payoff would be to the average male if they are all dividing paternity equally. And clearly the line for the alpha male is immensely better than the average for everybody. So indirect reciprocity is vulnerable to individuals who are able to capitalize on their personal power to be able to take resources from others or outcompete others for resources. All right, so that's groupishness. It's a behavior where you don't know what it is that you are going to gain from it. It's costly. It only occurs in humans. There are no canonical explanations. And alpha males in particular create a free rider problem. Okay, so now I want to turn to the TCK hypothesis for explaining groupishness. I apologize for TCK as a little neologism, but I think it helps to draw attention to something that's really special about humans, and I'm calling it TCK because that stands for targeted conspiratorial killing, and we'll see a little bit more about that in a minute. So the assumption that I start with here in thinking about the evolution of groupishness is that it evolved in multi-male groups dominated by an alpha male. And that is fair because that's the way that all non-human primates. Hypothesis into 2 steps. The first step is that an alliance of subordinate males gets together and kills the alpha male. As a result, they're able to constrain any would-be alpha males. This process of forming an alliance creates an all-powerful alpha alliance. They're able to kill the alpha male. That means they can kill anybody. They got the power of life and death over everybody in the group. This is a totally novel phenomenon for any mammal. And then step 2 is that the alpha alliance imposes norms. So they set norms such as, we don't want you to take resources from any of us. So they set norms to benefit themselves and the group. You're not allowed to kill each other. It backs up the norms by threatening any non-conformists. Initially they would threaten them and the non-conformists would agree, but if the non-conformists don't agree, then they get killed. So the effect of this is to select genetically over the long term for pro-social tendencies and against antisocial tendencies. Obviously, this is inadvertent. The males have no idea what is but by acting against competitive interests of the group, and is doing, therefore, is selecting for groupishness. So I just want to review evidence that comes partly from Christopher Boehm, who is responsible for 99% of this framework, to look at evidence that is partly cited in support and partly just conforms to it. So as I mentioned, all non-human primates have got alpha males. The alpha is defined by having defeated the previous alpha in a one-on-one fight. And he uses reactive aggression to respond to challenges. There are pictures here of bonobos. It's important to realize that bonobos do have alpha males. And in fact, I should have drawn attention to it, but current data are that they are getting as much paternity in relationship to group size as a chimpanzee alpha male. So there may be some reduction in aggressiveness overall in bonobos, but it doesn't stop alpha males being very successful. And so alpha male behavior is positively selected, and this is going to include their ability to use reactive aggression to defend their status. Secondly, you don't have alpha males in Homo sapiens. And here's a quote from Frank Marlowe. The Hadza certainly are egalitarian. This doesn't mean there are no individuals who would like to dominate others and have their way. It's simply difficult to boss them around. And James Woodburn wrote particularly about how it's difficult, which is basically the kind of argument I'll be giving here about collective action against the bosses. And by the way, he said, Frank Marlowe said the Hadza are egalitarian. He did also note that males are dominant females, not very much, but nevertheless, to some extent, they are. So when we say the Hadza certainly are egalitarian, what we really mean is that it's the males who are egalitarian with each other. And that, of course, is true of hunters and gatherers in general. So here we can portray the male dominance hierarchies. On the left, you see that at the top, you have individuals of higher rank. And in the non-human primates in the middle, you've got an alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, and so on. Confused a little bit by some coalitionary efforts, but nevertheless, overall, That's the sort of central core pattern. And the contrast is with nomadic hunter-gatherers, where all individuals are equal. Nobody can boss anybody else about. So what we can do is we can call that an alpha alliance, the sense in which individual human males have no alphas is because they are all alphas, if you like, or at least those that are part of the alpha alliance. Nomadic hunter-gatherers can be contrasted with settled groups where you certainly have alliance leaders, but they lead by consensus. And they cannot maintain their position simply by physically fighting and dominating everybody else when everybody else doesn't want them to. They have to, of course, jockey and organize their alliances, and they're constantly trying to make sure they have sufficient support to be able to stay in power, but they're not individuals. So the way we represent those is that you can have an alpha alliance at the top here, and then under it, a beta alliance. And they might be younger married men, they might be bachelors, younger age sets, and different political groups if you're looking at state societies. And then here we've got one of the alphas popping up and being the leader of the alpha alliance. So that's just trying to be explicit about what I'm thinking about when I'm saying that there are no alphas in, no alpha individuals in humans. Okay, thirdly, in societies that don't have prisons or armies or police, then of would-be alphas to revert to execution, where by execution I mean commonly approved killing of a group member. And this is significant, of course, because it means that if somebody is persistently violent and or otherwise breaks the norms of the society, then they can be got rid of. Normally, there's a whole series of efforts that many of the people listening to this talk know much better than I do, to stop someone being persistently selfish or violent, ignoring, ostracizing, deriding, ridiculing, leaving, exiling, and so on. But those do sometimes fail. And Christopher Boehm, in his extended review of hunter-gatherer societies, found cases where you get some individuals who are persistently violent despite all that, and then they do get killed. When they get killed, the aggression is proactive, it's premeditated, and it's either carried out by one individual who understands that everybody else is on his side, or sometimes by multiple individuals, as in the case shown at the bottom. And the significance of being proactive is that it means that the individuals who carry it out can plan very carefully and make it safe for the killers at the time that the kill happens. They wait for the victim to go up a tree and leave his weapons at the bottom, and while he's getting the honey out, the others move his weapons aside and then surround him when he comes down, and there's no chance of him to fight back. This means that executions can be delayed for a long time after the society has decided that they finally are fed up with this person. There are cases of it being delayed, not just for hours or days, but for weeks, months, or even years in some cases. But eventually, the guy is taken out. And note that here is this punishment for someone else's misdeeds, which is third-party punishment, but it's coalitionary third-party punishment, which means that there's a very low cost to those individuals who are carrying it out, and of course a very high gain in getting rid of someone who is personally threatening to them. And this is different, of course, from individual third-party punishment, which people have had a lot of time, a lot of problem trying to explain, particularly since it doesn't always happen. And Frank Marlowe himself, in his paper on Hadza cooperation, drew attention to the fact that there was very little evidence of third-party punishment happening at the individual level. And Polly Wiesner has shown the same thing in the Kalahari. The contemporary record of executions invokes many kinds of norm violations. Intimidation is certainly an important one, heading the list here. But this collection that Bohm found from the hunter-gatherer ethnographies shows that it can be for a wide variety of norm violations as well. Execution does seem to be a cultural universal. It hasn't literally been found in every hunter-gatherer group. I think one can explain that by saying that it was sometimes late to be studied in relationship to the arrival of missionaries or governments and so on. So it wasn't actually recorded for the Andamanese, but I think the expectation is that it would have been there. At any rate, it's found in hunters and gatherers on every continent. It's found in many hunters and gatherers who are relatively undisturbed by contemporary trends. And when it occurs, it is decided mainly by males, wherever you have a description of the processes leading to it. So execution appears to explain a great motivation to conform to the society's norms, because the Alpha Alliance, having an ability to kill the alpha, that means that no one in the community is safe. Nobody can openly deride members of the Alpha Alliance and expect that nobody will take action against them. Of course, initially, it may just be that you get a weak reputation and you can get your reputation back again. But that's what you've got to do. You can't defend yourself physically against the possibility of execution, because the premeditated attack by an alliance that is able to kill the alpha male is undefendable. So it's very dangerous to violate norms, and you have to conform. And here is an example of how dangerous it can be. A case from Australia, where some women saw the painted wooden trumpets that are special for the males, and they went back to the women's camp and told them what they'd seen. And when the men came back and heard of their behavior, Yaninja, the leader, but not a leader who can boss others around, said, "When will we kill them?" And they said immediately, and they're instantly put to death by members of their own clan. And this sort of thing is very startling to read about, and it's very unfamiliar to people working with hunters and gatherers nowadays, of course. But the further back you go, the more you see this sort of behavior. The interpretation of executions as being responsible for groupishness certainly fits with the generalization that when people are sort of thinking about moral behavior or reasoning or responding to moral dilemmas, then the generalization that seems pretty strong is that intuitions tend to be self-protective. There's a lot of plausible deniability in decisions involving morality. And here's Jonathan Haidt claiming that the first rule of life in a dense web of gossip is be careful what you do, and the second rule is you better be able to frame your actions in a positive light. It certainly is not a challenge, those sorts of generalizations, to the idea that execution is selected for groupishness. And you will find similar sorts of statements in small-scale societies, the Azande here, conforming to a high standard of good manners for fear of being accused of witchcraft, which of course is liable to lead to being executed, and the Lele, danger of being accused of sorcery, encouraging a modest, placatory demeanor in older men. And I want to draw attention to the notion that once you have an alpha alliance, then the evolutionary theory would expect two kinds of norm, and the one that most people draw attention to for norms in society in general are norms that benefit the whole group, such as, hey, let's all share, or let's share when individuals have a rough day and need to be supported. Let's suppress conflict and so on. But the other kind is norms that instead of benefiting the whole group, benefit just the senior males. And in that case, we're talking about norms that will enforce male secrecy, for instance, in forming their alliances, male dominance over females in a number of ways, legitimizing males to beat up their wives if their wives are bad cooks, for instance. And married men's dominance over bachelors is another easy example. Christopher Boehm, he suspected that chimpanzees could conduct execution, and therefore he had to go through a sort of series of mental gymnastics to explain why you don't have morality and groupishness in chimpanzees. Well, it turns out, a careful look at the data, that there is a big difference between humans and chimps, and I conclude that humans are the only mammal capable of executing adults. And the reason is that execution requires prior agreement. It is targeted. There is an agreement that X, individual X, has behaved so badly, he's got such a bad reputation, he's so appalling to be with, he's been so resistant to efforts to get him to change his behavior, we're going to target him and we're going to kill him. And it's conspiratorial. We are all agreed about this. And in order to get that conspiracy and decide who the target is, I don't see how you can do it without a pretty sophisticated language. And that language is also needed for trust, because what you don't want to do is to start suggesting that somebody should be killed and then be shocked to that potential victim, who will then turn around and form a coalition against you. So the dangers of an unstable coalition mean that it's very important to negotiate very carefully with others about the prospects for killing some individual. And that's why it seems to me that language is going to be needed. Now, chimpanzees, of course, are able to use coalitions to kill members of neighboring groups, but there's no difficulty about deciding who the target should be or who is going to be on whose side. But within group killings, of which 13 have been recorded, but only about 7 in sufficient detail to really understand them well, it turns out that those that we know about are not executions. They're occurring by reactive aggression, not proactive aggression. So you don't see any stalking, you don't see any hunting, you just get individuals responding to circumstance. And most importantly, they are not counter-dominants. They are not targeted specifically against alphas. And in one case, when an alpha was killed, it was immediately replaced by one of the killers to become the new alpha. So killings maintain the alpha role. And so this is an important point, I think, that humans are the only mammal capable of this complicated behavior. So based on that, the TCK, targeted conspiratorial killing hypothesis for groupishness, following Christopher Boehm's work, is this, that you see a chain of logic from the ability to conduct a killing to killing the norm violators, selecting against norm violating tendencies, and that's producing groupishness. And that is very much the Boehm argument. Okay, so summarizing that, the idea is you've got these 2 steps. Step 1, subordinate males are conspiring to kill the alpha and they create an alpha alliance. And step 2, the alpha alliance imposes norms. So I now want to use data on self-domestication to test this. And this is something that Christopher Boehm did not include in his book. I think there is a clear logic to why these things are connected, because once you have execution, an ability to do it, then there should be these 2 major effects: groupishness that Boehm drew attention to, and self-domestication. Why self-domestication? Well, reactive aggression supports the success of an alpha male. And execution of alphas should therefore select against the genes for reactive aggression. And when you select against reactive aggression in captivity, as Dmitry Belyaev did and various subsequent researchers, then what you produce is a domestication syndrome. So you select individuals who have got low reactive aggression. In other words, in the case of the foxes, you walk towards them when they are a certain age and you wait for them to snarl, and you write down the individual distance at which they snarled, and you breed from the ones who allowed the humans to get closest and showed the least tendency for reactive aggression. And then within a few generations, what you find is that the domestication syndrome, which can include more than 20 different traits of biology, bones, physiology, behavior, and cognition, starts emerging in any one individual or even in any one population. You cannot predict exactly which traits are going to emerge. It's an unpredictable mixture. But even though it varies by these various different levels, individual, population, species, it is predictable that you will get a domestication syndrome as a consequence of breeding for low reactive aggression. So if we imagine that there is some distribution in chimpanzees or some ancestor of humans in the amount of investment that an individual male puts into becoming alpha. And I got two chimps here because they're familiar to me. Humphrey was really aggressive, and he's on the right, and Jomeo on the left showed incredibly little interest in being aggressive and competing to be an alpha male. These are chimpanzees in Gombe. So now suppose that there is selection against alpha males, as you would get from executing them. And that will mean that there will be a shift to the left of the amount of individual male investment in becoming alpha. And that is what I mean by self-domestication. Self-domestication defined as a reduction in the propensity for reactive aggression. So a few tests of this. First of all, humans should have low rates of reactive aggression. I mean, maybe you could put this in the first category of this just sort of fits with Boehm's thesis, but he didn't actually know these data. And this is pretty striking because what you're seeing here is calculations of the rates of physical aggression per 1,000 hours of observation. And you see it for 4 different years from Gombe and Kaniwara on the left, and data about to emerge from other sites will strongly support this. And then you have from a population of Australians in Arnhem Land who were using a lot of alcohol in a very poorly, sort of very highly disrupted society. So these were meant to be a particularly aggressive human people. They have vanishingly low rates compared to what we see in chimpanzees. Bonobos show similar rates to the chimpanzees, by the way. All right, a more sort of closer test here. Homo sapiens should have a self-domestication syndrome. So we have a domestication syndrome, and I say the view from archaeology because archaeologists use a few data on bone anatomy to be able to recognize when they dig up a skull or a body from the dirt, whether or not it is a domesticated species or their wild ancestor. And this was drawn attention to by Helen Leach in 2003. And she said, lo and behold, humans have got 5 features that people use to recognize domesticated species compared to their wild ancestors: a lighter body, the shorter face, smaller teeth, feminization of the skull and skeleton, brain reduction, which may or may not be a really viable one. It's happened relatively recently, and it is sometimes explained in other ways, and pedomorphic features. And so what this gives rise to, since the earliest Homo sapiens has now been recorded about 315,000 years ago, is this scenario at the bottom, where we had alpha males present up to 300,000 years ago. And then you have a rare event, the reactive aggression reversal event, when targeted conspiratorial killing happens. And for the first time, alpha males can be predictably killed. and that after that, you get increasing reduction of alpha males. Test 3, the domestication syndrome traits should become more pronounced over time. And Sierre and colleagues led by Brian Hare showed that this was true, that the brow ridge has been reduced and the face has become narrower. These both appear to be domestication syndrome traits. And the narrowing of the face is a particularly nice one from a point of view of research, because it does seem to be pretty consistently correlated with aggression. And the photograph of hockey players here is because of the studies done by Justin Le Carre and others looking at hockey players, because you can get a readout of how aggressive they are by how much time the referee makes them spend in the penalty box. So here you see graphs of the relationship between the number of penalty minutes and the width of the face. And in every case, you get a positive relationship. These are 6 professional hockey teams. The same thing was done for 6 college hockey teams. There's lots of variance. It certainly isn't a very strong prediction, but the consistency of the prediction means that overall, you can say that the more time spent in the penalty box is associated, or the wider the face, then the more time they spend in the penalty box, and therefore the more aggressive they appear to have been on average. And there are lots of studies of this association. You get a larger facial width in men than in women. It's perceived by people as more masculine. It's higher in bigger men. It's associated with more threatening behavior. It's associated with dominance, and it's associated with fighting and fighting ability and antisocial behavior. These results are not affected by socioeconomic status, by presence of beards, which might have thrown people off, or by race. So this seems pretty impressive, and there are now some big meta-analyses that support that. 4th test, Homo sapiens, being the only Homo with domestication syndrome traits, should be different genetically from them. So here we have large, wide faces shown in Neanderthals, reconstructed in Denisovans based on genes associated with facial width. And what this suggests is that the reduction in facial width is unique to modern humans. It hasn't happened in other species of Homo. And so that means that Homo sapiens should be the only Homo having genes associated with domestication. And this is an early area of research. Certainly, you can say that there are initial studies, but since 2014, we have had a paper in which there is an argument that domestication is strongly associated with reduced population of neural crest cells or slower movement of neural crest cells. So neural crest cell migration being distorted in domesticated animals compared to their wild ancestor, apparently as a mechanism to achieve the reduced reactive aggression, and then incidentally leading to the other domestication syndrome traits. And so far, domestication genes, call them that, have been found in Homo sapiens, but not in Neanderthals or Denisovans. So there has been a quantitative difference in the frequency of these genes associated with domestication that applies to sapiens, but not to Neanderthals or Denisovans. And the dating is exactly what you would hope for, so sometime prior to Homo sapiens. So this certainly is fun in preliminary evidence suggesting that there has been selection against reactive aggression uniquely in Homo sapiens, and therefore thinking that this supports the notion of alpha males being selected against. And here's one example of that. So a neurocrystopathy is a a condition of a damaged system of neural crest migration. And BAZ1B is a gene on chromosome 7 that its effects are quite well known. It's known to promote neural crest cell migration. It regulates craniofacial development. Remember that domesticated animals have short faces and small teeth, and it regulates temperament. And genes for reduced dosage of BAZ1B have been found in domesticated animals in human patients who have got somewhat sort of domesticated-like phenotypes, and in Homo sapiens compared to Neanderthals and Denisovans. So that was 4 tests on using self-domestication. And the fact that Boehm didn't know about this, I think, is makes them essentially a priori. We've got low reactive aggression in humans compared to chimps and bonobos. We've got, of course, what the proper test is with pre-sapiens, and there some efforts have been made in that direction using anatomical data, cranial trauma, but it's too early to produce any conclusions on that. Secondly, Homo sapiens does have an anatomical self-domestication syndrome. Thirdly, brow ridge and facial width are being reduced over time, and facial width strongly associated with aggression, so it goes in the right direction. Reduction in facial width associated with reduced aggression. And Homo sapiens being the only Homo with a self-domestication syndrome and having domestication-associated genes. So I'm inclined to think that part 3, the data on self-domestication, is a support for the TCK hypothesis for explaining groupishness. Here's the problem. We can assume that 300,000 years ago, we have an ancestor that there's no indication that they were living in particularly large groups and that they were self-domesticated. So if they were neither of those things, then the question is, how did they come to be so today? How did their descendants become to be self-domesticated and groupish? What Boehm has argued, he summarizes here. The theory I propose can be put very simply. What put this very decisive brand of egalitarianism so firmly in place was the ability of politically unified groups to outlaw and punish resented alpha male behavior. And that is what we see nowadays. And so essentially what Boehm has done is to read the present back into the past. And self-domestication, I think its nature and timing support Boehm's hypothesis. They suggest that reactive aggression, the propensity for reactive aggression, has been reduced in the evolution of Homo sapiens. And how do you explain it? I think it's hard to explain the loss of alpha male in humans without execution. One strand that people have tried to suggest is that female choice might be important. After all, female choice is fairly important nowadays in humans. Maybe it was important then. But I think you have to think yourself back to 300,000 years ago when we're getting the first little hints of selection against reactive aggression. And at that point, the males would have been very tough individuals. They would have been highly coercive, much more like the alpha males of gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos than they would have been with contemporary humans. And I think the coercive alpha males would have been expected to overwhelm female choice, as certainly happens in chimpanzees today. So that's why I favor this logical pathway, that execution kills the alpha behaving males, selects against reactive aggression, and leads to the self-domestication syndrome. And then at the same time, what it's doing is killing the norm violators, as we saw, selects against norm violating tendencies, and leads to groupishness. And those two features then really sort of become instantiated in what we can say is a new species, Homo sapiens. So how did all this get going? People have criticized me for saying, well, you're a Deus ex machina, you just sort of say language appears. And that's fair enough. To me, the question is, why is it that humans have got this astonishing ability which has huge impact on society and no other species does that we know of? And I've made my case earlier in this talk for why it is that improved language would be important. So this is not to say that Neanderthals were free of language. I bet they had lots of language. But you have to have a very sophisticated language to be able to form the conspiracies that enable you to target a terrifying individual, somebody who can personally, individually beat you up. So that's the argument, and I have no idea how to explain why language became more sophisticated in a pre-sapiens ancestor than it would have done in Neanderthals or Denisovans. Too bad, and that's a problem. But once it gets going, then you can imagine a positive feedback loop. And I've got an arrow here going from Homo sapiens, now groupish and self-domesticated, better able to communicate with each other, going to improved ability to execute, improved ability to coordinate and take out the norm violators and so on. But of course, that arrow should also go to the language, and it would be probably improving the ability for language as well. So you will not have let me give this talk probably without noting that there's been very little about females in here. And I'm deeply conscious of this and kind of embarrassed about it in a way, because if we were talking about an ideal research world, we'd be talking about a world in which somehow there'd be equal significance for females and males, because that's the way we want it nowadays in terms of our contemporary politics. But my awkward conclusion is that male behavior is primarily responsible for the evolution of groupishness and self-domestication, and therefore for the evolution of Homo sapiens, because males, for selfish reasons, wanted to control the alpha male. It was a zero-sum game in terms of the amount of paternity that the males who were originally beta, gamma, delta, and so on were getting. So for selfish reasons, they wanted to control the alpha male. And then they discovered that they had a deal going that was unbeatable, because now all of a sudden you've got an alpha alliance of males who've got control of life and death over everybody in the group. And they, at that point, are able to impose their whim. That's the argument. Overall, some pros and cons, starting with the cons for the TCK hypothesis. I totally admit ignorance about how we get it started. Where does sufficient language come from? We don't know anything about the rates of execution in the past, and it's startling to think that they were happening at high enough rates to select for groupishness. Bruce Nauft found a case in the Gange in Papua New Guinea of horticulturists in which 24% of men died from being executed. That maybe shows an upper limit. It shows that high rates are possible. And we have to go back to a much starker, more rough world. We shouldn't be thinking about contemporary societies for how to analyze the kinds of rates of execution and the styles of execution that would have happened in the past. In other words, we don't know. And as I say, I've been mute about females' influence. Now, this is not to say that females will be uninfluential. It certainly seems reasonable that male coalitionary decisions would be influenced by senior women, even maybe by junior women. But the core dynamic seems to me to depend on the male relationships as I have described. In favor of the TCK hypothesis, it explains why our biology resembles that of domesticated animals. It says why we've got a low propensity for reactive aggression. It says why humans have got egalitarian male dominance hierarchies. It says why societies are dominated by male alliances, why morality involves self-protection, and it gives an explanation for why we are groupish, solving the free rider problem. So it gives a new view on the evolution of indirect reciprocity. The conventional wisdom is that when everybody helps each other, then the whole society benefits, and then everybody shares the benefit. Cooperation is good for society. And the overwhelming research effort has been to find ways to justify that idea. So conventional wisdom is you strategize for a good reputation, everybody gets a good reputation, they cooperate with each other, you get increased resources, and so on. And as I said, this is vulnerable to powerful free riders, the alpha males who would come in and just take over. The TCK hypothesis is a different strategy. Yes, you strategize for a good reputation, but no, your goal is to protect yourself from being thought of as a norm violator or as a non-investor in the good of the group, or from being seen as being antisocial. And your gain is to reduce the risk of being executed. So why does C help A, or why does A help B in the first place? Because they're trying to impress the powers that be that they are good people and do not deserve to be thought of as witches, to have a bad reputation, and therefore ultimately get to the point where they might be executed. So this means that the new view is that group level benefits, they're really an incidental outcome of male-male competition rather than being the target of selection themselves. So I'm saying humans evolved to be non-groupish and groupish. And I just love the resonance that this has to Homo duplex, Durkheim's concept. He drew attention to humans being what he called egoistic and moral. And these two tendencies, for egoism, which is my non-groupishness, and morality, which is my groupishness, they mutually contradict and deny each other. There is a true antagonism between them because there's no moral act that doesn't imply a sacrifice. When you are groupish, you can't be non-groupish at the same time. You are being self-sacrificial temporarily. Durkheim says, a picture of Australian hunter-gatherers to remind us that he got a lot of his information from Australian hunter-gatherers. He asks, where does this duality and antinomy, irreconcilable principles, come from? How is it that each of us is a monster of contradictions that can never completely satisfy itself? He didn't have a good answer to that, but he said that this duality leads to these important dualities in human life: the profane versus the sacred, the body versus the soul, motivations for sensations versus conceptual thought. And so my answer is that self-domestication and groupishness evolved in parallel in response to execution. This probably began around 300,000 years ago, when we see the first hints of anatomy changing in the direction of reduced reactive aggression, execution being the only plausible mechanism. So groupishness probably happening at the same time because you've got execution there, following Boehm's argument, and fitting some archaeological evidence such as hints of larger social networks around that time. And what I'm suggesting here is that I think this is a really exciting research area. It's going to be particularly exciting following the genetic evidence as it comes in. But it also may have connections to Durkheim. And once we understand more about groupishness and non-groupishness, maybe we can also understand something more about some of these very sort of deep issues in human existence, the profane and naked, sacred, sensations versus conceptual thought, and the body versus the soul. I just want to thank the Frank Marlowe family for supporting this lecture. I want to thank Brian for inviting me and organizing it, and a whole bunch of people, including Frank, for all sorts of stimulating thought. And just draw attention to the fact that Chris Boehm in the top row there very sadly died just at the end of last year. That's a big loss to us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks. I'm speaking on behalf of a big coalition of audience members. I've enjoyed your talk
Don't
immensely.
execute me. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I stop sharing?
Yes. Yes, you can stop sharing, and you see all the hands. If you can see either attached or to the right of your screen is hopefully a list of participants. And what we normally do is just anyone who would care to raise their hand can do so. And if you're comfortable with just calling on people as you see them, that would be useful.
Yeah, I don't have a list of participants.
Okay, all right. So I can watch over that list and do some mic control here. So Katrina.
Hello. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you about the sort of beginning of your talk when you introduced the idea of groupishness in humans and non-groupishness, and I'll just focus on non-human primates. And I wanted to think about that idea a little bit, and I had these thoughts, and I wonder what you think about it. So I want to think about sort of the state of what we know about reciprocal behavior in non-human primates, and we have as I sort of think about it, we have a very rich theory, but there's this interesting maybe challenge of measurement in a way, because that we know so much, there's so much research has been done, but there's these issues of time scale, of cross-commodity exchanges that are just hard to actually go out and measure. So it's sort of a problem of rich theory. How do you actually translate it into actually understanding what animals are doing? So I was wondering if you would entertain the idea that if we were able to better somehow think about time scale issues or cross-commodity exchanges, and through experiments or wild studies, whether that could actually change some of our understanding of non-groupishness and non-human primates. Thank you.
Well, yes, I'm sure you're right, and that's a great point. And it's a bit of a blanket assertion I'm making that there is this difference, but it seems to me that whenever people look carefully at prosocial behavior in primates, when you find it, that there does seem to be a return benefit route that the actor, the donor, can reasonably be expected to assess. Now, that may be wrong. What you're raising in your question is the possibility that people will find that there are cases in which individuals are cooperating in ways that do not anticipate any kind of reasonable direct reciprocity, even by a complicated route. And that's true. That may be found. And if someone already knows, has a good sort of persuasive case of that, then I guess I want to hear it. Yeah,
I guess I don't have it.
Not there.
I guess my point was that the theories are kind of hard to translate sometimes in these animals' lives that are also very rich. And so I don't see it as a problem with measurement itself. I think theories themselves sometimes have sort of it's hard to match them and know whether our theories are actually, no theory is perfect ever, right? But it's it's a sort of like a matching game, and what we know might not, I hope we will develop better theories. That I think that's the only hope I can have. That was my
okay. But so do you think there are any cases at the moment that are good candidate cases for undermining the claim of no groupishness in non-human primates?
I don't know about non-groupishness, but my sense was thinking about time scale issues, at what time scales animals might be exchanging, and what kind, they could be exchanging many commodities, and how the help sort of flows. Not mostly, I think we'll look at dyadic level, and I think there's a good case to be made that is probably mostly dyadic level, but maybe we just didn't sort of. It's hard. I'm just trying to say it's a very hard problem to actually understand. There's so many behaviors there could potentially exchange in something like a primate group who, let's say, they live in this community, and it would, I think theories are not are quite sometimes hard to translate into very complex lives of these animals.
Well, fair enough. Yeah, and I expect the, yeah, I mean, the opportunity is there to test that.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks, Katrina. I would like to ask a question myself, Richard, regarding the role of weaponry. You know, my experience in Tanzania, for example, I've seen lethal and dangerous violence occur under various contexts, but the way that these disputes occur when you're armed with very deadly weaponry is different than how it occurs when hand-to-hand physical confrontation is the means by which dominance and other sources of aggression are resolved in non-human primates. So I'm just wondering if you imagine a Heidelbergensis or other, or mid-Pleistocene hominin having more dangerous weaponry, where instead of having a kind of physical mediation for any kind of conflict between males, now you have weapons that allow you to kill from afar. All else equal, would that not contribute to some reduction in the physical traits that are correlated with dominance in other species or other contexts, and change the physiological package without necessarily having any effect on needing to invoke language or even alliance systems? Not to say that those things wouldn't have their own effects, but I'm just wondering if you can have some of this syndrome and downstream consequences of the increased precarity of being the alpha, just as a function of knowing that anyone potentially could strike and cause great harm like that. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the independent role of weaponry in all this.
Well, I agree that it's a very important issue to consider, and it draws attention to the fact that the correlations I'm making are overly simplistic. As I say, okay, we find evidence for reduced reactive aggression at 300,000, and boom, it must be because of the argument being made. There could be other reasons for it, yes. But I don't think that weapons fits very nicely. And the reason is that it's not clear what kind of weapon would have come in at that time to really change the costs and benefits of violence. So I'm thinking about the fact that if you're just talking about stones, of course, the ability to use stones or sharpen stones goes back maybe to Lameque, I mean, more than 3 million years ago, and more and more sophisticated kinds of stones. Whoops, excuse me. I've lost.
Richard, we can still see and hear you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll just carry on. My point about weapons is that I don't see any good correlation of weapons with the 300,000 year mark. So stones are obviously, nothing very dramatic happening at that point. Spears, already sophisticated according to the Schellingen work by 400,000. So it would have been a bit earlier, you'd think. And projectile weapons, most people put a bit later. I think arrowheads, no one's confident about arrowheads before 70,000, are they? So I think I've produced an empirical answer to that point of yours, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. And I'm not familiar enough with the 300,000 as a real discrete marker of the physiology. I thought that there was just a more gradual decline. But anyway, I want to open up the room. So I see Dan raise his hand.
Thanks, Richard. Really, really stimulating. I have a kind of a logical concern and then an ethnographic concern. So the logical concern is why execution doesn't just result in a tendency to form despotic cabals, right? So, you know, a powerful, highly aggressive cabal that continues to use dominant strategies rather than prestige strategies, that has, you know, no need for norms. All they need is direct reciprocity among their members, that they support one another the way many, many primates do in agonistic conflicts, right? Sufficient to overpower an alpha. My ethnographic concern, and I say this, you know, with the same caveats that any ethnographer should apply, which is that there's a very strong tendency to overgeneralize from cases that one knows well. But I did live for almost 3 years in a community that has many of the characteristics of those that you've described, including, you know, execution of norm violators. And I think you have the causal arrow totally reversed in terms of the fitness consequences there. You kind of alluded to this with one bullet point, which is that execution is the last ditch measure that communities employ when all of the normal sanctions, which directly affect fitness, they affect everything from people's daily subsistence activities to their mating opportunities, to the survival of their offspring, to their own wellness in times of illness or injury. Really, really strong rubber hits the road kinds of fitness effects, right? Those fitness effects are because of norm-governed interactions, right? So in taking contemporary peoples and using the case of execution to make an inference about the past, and this isn't, I'm not talking about all of the problems of using extant peoples as you know, somehow mistaking them for living fossils, which I understand that you're not doing. But instead, I think what you have seen is the consequence when there's severe pathology in a society, which is really what these individuals boil down to. They're psychopathic, right? That they're just not responsive, not only to the normal sanctions, but to the normal fitness incentives that everyone else around them is. Then the people around them have no other choice but to execute them, okay? So you've ignored the day-to-day, really, really important fitness consequences of social interaction and focused on a way that societies deal with a very, very small percentage of individuals.
Well, yeah, there's a lot in that. I suppose, you know, the big picture I would say is that we have to think ourselves back to a time when males were much more brutal than they are now, and would pay very little attention to the more minor forms of sanction that you were drawing attention to. You know, those work nowadays because we've already got to the point where males are very much self-domesticated and groupish. But at a time when that was not true, a time when they were, you know, much more like the behavior, and I admit that I think of them as being much more like chimpanzees, then it would be much harder to get to the point where you can persuade such a male to stop. And you referred to them as, you know, just these rare individuals who are essentially psychopathic. It seems to me that a good way to think about the behavior of all non-human primate males is equivalent to human psychopaths, and that the evolution of psychopathy has been a negative a selection against psychopath-like behavior starting 300,000 years ago. So we should think of people as being, you know, our ancestors at that point, as being essentially amoral, you know, paying no attention to what the rest of the society might think of as right and wrong, willing to be entirely selfish, using violence in their own ends. And so, you know, this seems to me to be to create a limit on the merit of contemporary societies for thinking about the past.
Well, I would suggest, I mean, I want to hear from John and Molly, so I'll be brief, but I would suggest that while your account is a dramatic and sort of attention-grabbing one, not in the cheap sense, but in the salience, psychological salient sense, that you've kind of neglected a Darwinian gradualism that should lie at the heart of any evolutionary theory, which is that as the benefits of cooperation for things like foraging, predator defense, scavenging, right? The basic way of making a living that relies on a high variance subsistence strategy, those would have occurred very, very gradually. And so the benefits of conforming to others' estimations would have similarly increased over time, right? As it is right now, you have kind of a punctuated equilibrium problem. They couldn't cooperate until they could, okay? And then they killed the bad guys, which is frankly what Freud thought. And I find similar problems with both your theory and his, original theory. But I'm sure you have a strong rebuttal to that, but I'm also cognizant of time, and I want to hear from John and Molly and our other colleagues. So I'll be quiet.
I've got an amazingly good rebuttal, but I'll keep it to myself.
All right, John.
Hi, Richard. Great talk. I have a couple comments. One, when I think of, first of all, of TCK, I immediately think of traditional cultural knowledge with the big literature, and the acronym is really popular. But anyway, so I thought maybe a better acronym would be better since that's such a well-established one. But the other thing that came to mind, I first started thinking about this and corresponding with Chris Bohm years ago, and finding two cases when I was doing work in Highland New Guinea of assassination attempts exactly of the sort you're talking about. I thought they were safer and more clever, and that is they just told the enemy, we're going to be on this trail on a certain day and a certain time. And as they went down the trail and the enemy came out, they just walked away and allowed him to be assassinated. And some of the descriptions were he had gotten just so despotic that he wasn't happy with his 15 wives. He started having affairs with the wives of his kinsmen. And that was the thing that put over the top. But I also was introduced to a man who was the most renowned killer of his generation. He was an old man at this point. And I asked him, how many children did he have? And he said none. And I said, he said, I had a wife, but she was older. We never had any children. I said, why? He said, well, a couple of reasons. First of all, I like killing so much that people are always gunning for me. So I could never go home and help her with her gardens. And then she eventually left him. He goes, but no one, he goes, the reason why, he goes, is no one wanted to give me their daughter to marry because they were afraid that the conflicts that I created, because I was such a loose cannon, right? So like killing would then, that they would be involved in those conflicts and be targeted about. And so the other thing I'm thinking about is another pathway. And that is that not an alternative pathway. I think something that goes side by side. But the other thing that's uniquely human is we have households units with fathers with paternal certainty and interest in therefore controlling the reproduction of their daughters. And when you have a situation, and I know lots of cases where father-in-laws in particular, but also mothers and too, because a marriage is a bonding between two lineages, which says something about cooperation. That wouldn't they choose the more controllable son-in-law? I have a choice between these son-in-laws. My wife thinks that this really aggressive Turk guy is really good, but you know what? I'm not sure he's going to be a valuable member of my coalition. I want someone who I can control and who's controllable. And so that's another form of selective breeding, right? It's not just killing the alpha, but choosing who gets to mate with your daughter, or something like that, as another way of another pathway to self-domestication. And wondered what you thought about that.
Well, first of all, that's fascinating ethnographic observations, and my tendency is to give the same kind of response I gave to Dan, which is that I think we have to think ourselves a much rougher world. And what you said about a father-in-law choosing for a son, that makes every sense nowadays. But if you have a social world in which there is an alpha male who can personally defeat every other male in the group and does so, and forces every other male to subordinate themselves to him, which is what happens in chimpanzees, So, why shouldn't it have happened in our ancestors?
Well,
To
Richard,
the point where the father-in-law didn't have that kind of control.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to add to that the place I work traditionally had the second highest homicide rates of any society in the world, with 50% male homicides. And in fact, last time I was in the field, we had a homicide. So homicides are still, actually right now, the homicide rates are probably equal to what Shagnon reported with the Yanomamo. They're less than 50%, but still pretty high. But in that context, what you want is cooperation and control within your coalition.
Yeah.
But the ability to exert violence, cooperative violence against the enemy, right? So even in a very hostile environment, once you start playing coalitional game, once you get a coalitional psychology going on, then really it's not loyalty to groupishness in general. It's loyalty to my group, right? It's a very specific kind of loyalty where an alpha can demonstrate his ability to exert violence by what he does to the enemy. And he's sending a signal to the in-group. I'm an alpha. I could do this to you, but I'm not, because you're my good friend. And I'm going to cooperate with you. And it's that balancing of traits that I think was probably, at least my feeling of it, once you get coalitional behaviors and you get these kinds of structures, was common in the evolutionary past. But what do you think about that?
That seems totally reasonable. I mean, once you start playing coalitional games, they become very, very complicated very, very quickly. And, I take the point that what I'm actually reversing now to Dan's point, that what I'm doing here is making too simple a story. That is fair enough. But at the same time, while it is certainly true that coalitions are going to complicate the story immensely, I think there is going to be something special about what happens when humans can, for the first time, use each other to execute somebody else. It seems to me it is liable to produce some kind of watershed.
One last point, actually, piggybacking on something that
we should actually move on. I'm sorry, John, to cut you off. I'm really sorry, but
okay.
Great to talk to you, John.
Yeah, great discussion. Molly had her hand up for a long time, and then followed by Clark.
Oh, all right. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I would like to hear the responses to all of these interesting comments from the other questioners. I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit of what this looks like in terms of how selection is functioning in the present post-industrial realm, and as our species moves forward with a much more hierarchical and less egalitarian social structure, whether that generates any, whether this hypothesis would generate any further predictions that you didn't mention yet.
Well, it's not something I've got data on. I'm aware of the discussion about contemporary self-domestication. There would appear on the face of it to be the potential for selection against violence being exerted by prisons. And what prisons do is, so far as I know, unknown with regard to reproductive success. Obviously the expectation would be that if someone goes to prison for a number of years, then they're going to have fewer offspring. But maybe that's not true. Maybe they make up for it later. But if it is true, then it's clear that, first of all, psychopaths spend much more time in prison than non-psychopaths. So there should be selection against psychopaths from prison. And secondly, in general, there is, the people who go to prison tend to be more violent than people who don't. So I can see that there could be some continuing selection against violence and against psychopathy from contemporary societal practices. The difficulty about this in the case of America, USA, is that there are obviously huge social, political components to who gets to go to prison. So, you know, it's a very kind of sensitive and dangerous area to be thinking about, because the implication is that blacks are more violent. There's going to be selection against black violence, and you know, to some extent that may be true. But the fact that the prison population in the States is so enormously biased in favor of blacks has got doubtless much more to do with competition between beta groups and gamma groups, alliance networks, than simply the biology of racial violence. So, you know, I want to say there are possibilities for understanding something about the human future, because all societies do have problems of violence, and you know, we are still not behaving with a degree of loss of reactive aggression that a lop-eared rabbit does. And so there is, you know, sufficient variance in violence that societies have to deal with that. And probably, you know, we are still on the path to becoming more self-domesticated, less reactively violent. But somebody might come up and say, well, you know, there's also some evidence that those who are doing better in terms of their reproduction might have higher propensities for reactive violence. So how those tendencies would balance against each other, we'd need data.
Clark, would you like to add?
Do we have time?
I think we do, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That was an interesting response to Molly. I'm not sure I would agree with your analysis of the American criminal justice system completely, but my question is different. You said earlier on, male behavior is primarily responsible for the evolution of Homo sapiens, which strikes me as a striking claim, no matter how you slice it, given that males are only half or less than half of our species. And it doesn't seem to me, I didn't follow how you get this from the data that you presented. It strikes me as more assertion than evidence-based. Can you briefly revisit like why you're saying that women's behavior has nothing to do with the evolution of our species?
I don't think I said that. I said that the influence of women is harder to detect, but I said it's probably there. So I don't want to be quoted in an exaggerated way.
Well, the quote is, male behavior is primarily responsible for the evolution of Homo sapiens. That was on.
That's right.
So that is a quote.
That's right, exactly. So, well, the argument is that you cannot get the evolution of systems of indirect reciprocity without getting rid of alpha males. But alpha males will use their domineering ability to undermine the benefits of cooperation among lower ranking individuals. And so this is why you don't have those sorts of groupish interactions in non-human primates. It's only in humans, once you get rid of the alpha males, that happens. Well, how do you get rid of alpha males? Females do not, on a whole, suffer that much from alpha males in general, compared to systems in which you don't have alpha males. It's the males who suffer from alpha males, much more than females. So, you know, if you are a female gorilla, you're not getting beaten up on a regular basis by an alpha male gorilla. But the males are having their fitness very strongly eroded by the presence of an alpha male gorilla. So it's the ability and the motivation of the lower ranking males to get rid of the alpha male and replace that role altogether that I see as fundamental to this evolutionary process. You know, it is not that I think that males are somehow, you know, more important or more valuable or more clever or anything like that. You could say the opposite in many ways for all of those adjectives compared to females. I think it's just that there is a dynamic that is absolutely vital to the process of groupishness, and that is supported by the evidence on self-domestication.
I see. So the main evidence that you're pointing to is that no matter who the alpha male is, women still survive and reproduce.
Well, I wouldn't say that's the main evidence, but that is consistent with what I was saying. Yes. Yeah. You know, in some ways, it may be a disadvantage to females to move from an alpha male system to a multi-male system. It all depends on what kind of multi-male system is generated. You know,
Yes.
there's far more coercion of females in chimpanzees than there is in gorillas. On the other hand, there's much less, or there's no coercion of females, or very little coercion of females by males in bonobos. So, you know, they went on different paths, and that's a really fascinating story.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And Richard, thank you very much for your talk. And we normally wrap up back at around 1:30, and we'd be taking this opportunity now just to thank you. Normally, of course, we'd like to take you out to coffee and have more extended discussion of this, and surely, given the wide breadth of topics addressed and the importance and difficulty of getting to the bottom of these things, we know that this is going to be fruitful for further discussion. So some of that will happen offline, and just want to say thank you for being here. So,
well, I just want to say, it's been so frustrating to see various old friends and not be able to talk to them, but hello, old friends, and hello, new friends too.